Hi, my name's Kyle, and this is the very first episode of Spaceflight Tonight. Alright, so thanks for joining me. This is going to be a weekly video series with an oddly daily type name. Spaceflight Tonight just sounded better than Spaceflight Weekly. Yeah. This is going to be a video series where I talk about new things happening in spaceflight and I answer your questions about launch vehicles, satellites, space stations, whatever. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them below, but let's jump into the news. So the first thing I want to talk about this week is the recent announcement from Orbital ATK that their next Cygnus ISS resupply craft will not be riding an Antares rocket. And that's kind of odd because, well, the Antares is Orbital's rocket. It seems to be that NASA and Orbital came together and decided that the schedule was too tight for comfort, and I think NASA also wanted to include more payload on the next resupply mission from Cygnus, and that was just something that Antares couldn't do. And this comes on the heels of news that SpaceX, of course, is going to be delayed since they've had their problem with the Falcon 9. And JAXA's resupply craft has also been delayed, so I think it was more important to get much needed supplies to the ISS as soon as possible rather than just wait around for Orbital to use their rocket. And of course, the biggest news this week was that we're going to have a new president. Well, what does that mean for space policy? It's a little bit too early to tell, but Robert Walker, Donald Trump's space policy advisor, has said that there will probably be a shift of funds toward manned spaceflight, specifically to deep space operations, versus Earth science. And this has a lot of people, rightfully so, concerned, because Earth science is a big part of climate change research, and that's something that many in the science community and the general public want to see continued. It's still too early to tell exactly how things are going to shake out, because we just don't know. There hasn't been really any concrete policy documents, but just like President Obama and President Bush before him, Donald Trump will likely issue what's called a national space policy, and the national space policy is the overall government document that defines what our strategy in space is going to be. Let's see what's next. Oh, questions. Here's where we get to questions about space. This week I found a question on Reddit. DDE93 writes, I've got a question that originates in KSP, which is Kerbal Space Program, but is applicable to real life. Once the inflatable Balut heat shield has done its job, how do you dispose of it? It seems to get in the way quite badly, not to mention that it's going to be a hot mess. Okay, just a quick primer for you guys who don't know what a Balut is. It's a balloon and a parachute, a Balut. And they were first developed in the 1960s as a way to arrest hypersonic vehicles. And they've gone through all kinds of weird iterations like toroidal parachutes, which is kind of like dragging a donut behind you, and other weird shapes. But the idea of using an inflatable heat shield is really attractive to spacecraft designers. And that's because it's lightweight. And remember, mass is such a critical factor in all spaceflight. So the lighter your heat shield, the more payload you can carry, which is generally great for everybody. The problem is, Balut heat shield is large. It has a lot of surface area and it will cover your whole craft, and it makes it really hard to steer your craft. It looks like Kerbal's Balut is based off of NASA's IRVE-3 spacecraft. NASA tested the IRVE-3 inflatable heat shield in 2012. Now, that spacecraft held on to its heat shield all the way till splashdown in the Atlantic. But that doesn't mean that every spacecraft that utilizes an inflatable heat shield has to hold on to it. So the problem with adding a detachment system to an inflatable heat shield is that's one more moving part. That's one more thing that can fail. And we're talking about the phase of all spaceflight that's probably the most dangerous. And if you don't minimize the risk, then terrible things could happen. Just look at all the spacecraft that have crashed into Mars. I think that we're going to see more development of retro-propulsive entry. Things like NASA's Sky Crane maneuver, which is way too complicated. which is probably a bad example. The Red Dragon from SpaceX is probably a good example of what we're likely to see, because payloads are only going to increase. Manned spaceflight has its unique risks, so we want to try to eliminate risk whenever possible. And I think that's probably why you won't see Balut-style inflatable heat shields on any manned spacecraft ever. It's just too risky. Okay, so light show for today, and that's okay because it's the first one, but you can find me on Reddit. I'm u/spaceflighttonight, facebook.com/spaceflighttonight, and of course you could subscribe here, and that would be great. I'm really trying to get to 100 subscribers because then I get like a special URL or something. But we're just getting started. Email me your questions also at spaceflighttonight@gmail.com, and I'd be happy to answer them. See you next week.